This is For the Rest of Us with Canon Megan and Adam, a podcast about theology, faith, the Bible, and life. You know, for the rest of us. Well, hey there. Welcome back to For the Rest of Us with Canon Megan and Adam. I'm not Megan Castellan. You all have figured that out by now. I'm Adam Eichelberger. I work with Megan. I'm a lifelong Catholic, baby Episcopalian. I'm just trying to figure this all out. And I get to boldly go with Megan where no one has gone before. Like the William Riker to her Jean-Luc Picard. So Megan, what have we got going on today for the rest of us?
Today we are returning to our occasional series, Better Know a Saint. And today we are talking about Dietrich Bonhoeffer.
Ooh, a good one. And this one, as we were coming on to record, I mentioned that there are certain groups within my Catholic background that have a real disliking. They don't really like Bonhoeffer, and I'm kind of new to Bonhoeffer. I mean, like, I've read about Bonhoeffer. I've read some of Bonhoeffer's stuff, but like, this is a new one for me. So I am definitely learning something with this one.
Yeah. Bonhoeffer, his feast day was last week, the anniversary of his martyrdom. So he is a timely saint, and also he is having a bit of a resurgence in popularity these days on all sides of our global spectrum right now, which we'll get into that. It's a little bit strange. So the short summation of who Bonhoeffer is, he was a German Lutheran pastor executed by the Nazis in 1945 for participating in a plot to assassinate Hitler. Yay!
Dang.
So he was, going out and doing some stuff. More to the point, he was also a really good theologian, and his insights into Christianity and the modern world, particularly as it relates to Christianity operating within an unfriendly state, are what is important for us right now in this moment, I would say. Bonhoeffer was born into an educated upper-class family in the early 20th century. He and his twin sister, he had a twin sister, were the 7th and 8th kids in the family. And they were one of those sort of overeducated German families that you sometimes hear about. Father was a psychiatrist who picked fights with Freud. Mother was a teacher. Everybody was super smart, super cultured. Dietrich was something of a prodigy early on. He was composing music for the local symphony at age 11.
Nerd alert!
And just being sort of obnoxious and brilliant. But he was encouraged to get educated and develop his brain from the very start. The family was also extremely patriotic. And this is going to become important in a bit. They sent all the children of fighting age off to World War I, where Dietrich's older brother Walter was killed in action when Dietrich was 12. So 2 years later, time passes, and Dietrich decides to go and study theology at age 14. This is a little unusual for his family. They weren't really churchgoers. They kind of went on the big holidays, but they were not devout. And he got pushback from his older siblings that this was going to be a waste of his life. But he defends a successful undergrad dissertation at the University of Berlin. He graduates at age 21 with his doctorate. Again, annoyingly brilliant. And his doctorate is on the church as an existing holy community and what that means. So here we need to talk about some context of what the church was like in Germany at the time. So if you remember from history class or English literature class, World War I did an absolute number on everybody. It wiped out an entire generation of young people, particularly in Europe. Everybody was devastated. Germany was devastated. The Treaty of Versailles kind of absolutely decimates their economy, their military, everything. But the German church was also really destroyed. Part of what had led to the war was nationalism within the church. The German Lutheran Church was state-run, and so there was a lot of unquestioned nationalism being preached from the pulpit on all sides of the war. The English church preached about God being on their side. The German church preached about God being on the German side. When the war ended, and Germany was defeated. The German church really had to wrestle with what it meant that God apparently was not on their side, because they lost, and they lost badly. So to some extent, the downfall of the German Empire was also the downfall of the German church. And they have to wrestle with the enormous death toll. They have to wrestle with their complicity in cheering on the war. And they have to wrestle with what all of that means for their theology. So there's going to be a whole movement in theology after World War I called Neo-Orthodoxy, of which Dietrich Bonhoeffer is going to play a big part, to kind of wrestle with beginning to extract nationalism out of Christianity. The other thing that is tripping up the state church at this point is that the way you get the church to enable a war and to convince an entire people to go to war is actually not so direct if you're reading the Gospels, right? You got Jesus sitting on the mountaintop and, saying, "Blessed are the peacemakers." So the way the German Lutheran Church had interpreted the Gospels, and particularly the words of Jesus, was to say, well, he didn't really mean that. Jesus didn't mean that stuff about making for peace, not being violent, forgiving others, giving everything you have to the poor. He didn't mean that. Those are just things he said to illustrate how impossible it is to lead a righteous life and to illustrate your need for God's redemption and grace, which is given to you freely in the person of Christ.
That seems like an awful lot of mental gymnastics.
Yes. But again, if you're a state church and your job is mostly to prop up and condone the actions of the state, you're going to have to do a lot to make the gospel do that work. It's not a direct path. So this is sort of the unquestioned attitude that Dietrich adopts. The gospels aren't to be taken seriously. They're there to illustrate the frailty of humanity, how far we have fallen from what God intends for us, and how much we need God's grace. Jesus doesn't really want you to forego violence. Jesus just says that so you realize how bad you are, because you keep having to beat up people in wars. Isn't that unfortunate for you?
What a reach.
So this thing happens, which does not get talked about nearly enough when we talk about Bonhoeffer, and that is, after he gets his doctorate, Bonhoeffer comes to New York City.
They come to America
And studies at Union Theological Seminary in 1930, which is where I have taken classes. Shout out to Union. He is unimpressed by American students and American theology. He thinks we are weak sauce. He thinks that we take the excesses of German theology and kind of make them worse. But at Union, he meets a Black fellow student named Frank Fisher. And Frank Fisher takes him to worship at the Abyssinian Baptist Church in Harlem. And there, Dietrich basically has a conversion experience because the Black church takes the gospel seriously. And for the first time, Dietrich hears from the pulpit somebody preaching that, yes, Jesus does want you to give away what you have. Yes, Jesus does call us to live a life without violence. Yes, Jesus has a problem with the Black people being lynched in the South. This is the 1930s. Lynching is a very big deal, and the Black church is taking a strong stand against lynching. This is part of the kind of movement against lynching, trying to get a federal anti-lynching bill passed. And Abyssinian Baptist Church has a proud history of civil rights activism. Bonhoeffer worships at Abyssinian Baptist Church throughout his years in New York City and teaches Sunday school there. And he credits going to that church and hearing those sermons by their pastor, who was at that time Adam Clayton Powell, the senior, with entirely changing his mind. It's being there and hearing the gospel preached there that convinces him that actually Jesus was serious. That when we read the gospel on the Sermon on the Mount, we are meant to do those things. That is how we are meant to live. And if we live like that, the world will be transformed. And so the Black church converts Dietrich Bonhoeffer. So he comes back to Germany, becomes a lecturer on theology, and finally gets ordained when he's 25. But he's got about 2 years before the Nazis take the government. 2 days after Hitler is installed as chancellor, Bonhoeffer goes on the radio and gives a radio address about how awful Hitler is. And the radio address is cut off as he is giving it. One of the things that he says in that address is that the church cannot just bandage the victims of injustice when they fall under the wheel of injustice, but the church has a responsibility to jam a spoke in the wheel as it turns. Now, as we know, because we talked about it on an earlier podcast, The Nazis didn't just take over the apparatus of the state. The Nazis also took over the church, very intentionally. A few months before his appointment as chancellor, Hitler had tried to hold new elections within the church and impose his own people. But once he became chancellor, he tried it again. He imposed illegal new elections within the church and installed a slate of his own Nazi sympathizers in all leadership positions. And Bonhoeffer wanted the clergy to go on strike. No performing sacraments, no marriages, no funerals, no weddings, no Sunday services, no nothing until the elections are reversed. Bonhoeffer is like over it. And he is deputized to write a manifesto to kind of rally the clergy together, but it doesn't quite come together. He can't get the clergy to move, which as someone who is clergy, I validate that experience. We are like cats. You can't get us to do much. And it keeps getting worse. In September 1933, the German Lutheran Church votes willingly to apply the Aryan paragraph to the church itself. And the Aryan paragraph, if you have forgotten your Nazi history, is the paragraph of civil law that disenfranchises and denies jobs to anyone who was related to a Jewish person 2 generations back. So pastors and church officials who were just of Jewish descent but had converted at some point, now had to step down from their post within the church. And this gets people mad. This strikes them as denying the authority of baptism. So now more people are mad. It's one thing to be a fascist. It's another thing to deny the authority of baptism. So we're sort of ranking up the offenses here. Then, as we talked about before, the Nazis remove the Old Testament from the printed Bible. More people get mad. Emerging from all this, Dietrich Bonhoeffer and Karl Barth is another famous neo-Orthodox theologian, draft what's called the Barmen Declaration in May 1934, which essentially establishes the confessing church. This is a declaration that says, it's very famous, you can go online and read it. It says that no human is the head of the church. The church answers only to Jesus Christ. Hitler's interference with church affairs amounts to blasphemy, and people owe their allegiance only to Christ. So this establishes basically a sect within the state-run church, and they kind of begin to do their own thing, more or less. It also puts them publicly opposed to the Nazi regime. It's worth remembering, as we keep talking about this, only 20% of German clergy ever belonged to the confessing church, which is a bummer.
Yeah, that really is. You know, when you see the world starting to fall down around you and you don't really do anything about it, that stinks, and it's a little prescient.
Yeah. There's a danger sometimes when we tell these stories of resistance from the Nazi era that we think that they were more widespread than they were. But what makes them important is that they were not widespread. It took so much courage and so much bravery to stand up because it was so rare. So Bonhoeffer is offered a job in Berlin at a church, but he refuses it. He's going on personal strike now. Instead, he goes to London and becomes pastor of the German-speaking church there. Sort of as a funny aside, he's getting constant furious letters from Karl Barth, who's like, "You've abandoned your church.
I've abandoned my child!
The house is on fire, and you're over there in London not doing anything." But what he is doing is building ecumenical connections with the Anglican Church. Bonhoeffer really was interested in ecumenism, making friendships between the denominations, which was a brand new idea at this point. He particularly befriends a number of Anglican bishops who serve in Parliament. So he's also befriending, sort of politicians who are going to become helpful later. He is doing this so much that the head of the state Lutheran Church comes over personally and tells him to stop, and he refuses. Because again, he's publicly now against the state church. He returns in 1935, and he starts an underground seminary for the confessing church. Because they were publicly opposed to the state-run church, a lot of what they were doing was illegal. The underground seminary is at a place called Finkenwald. At this point, he's not allowed in the city of Berlin. And Karl Barth has been deported back to Switzerland. They're deporting people. Just want to throw that out there. Martin Niemöller has been arrested and sent to a camp. They managed to run Finkenwald without detection for 2 years, but the Gestapo raid the seminary, arrest about 30 students, and close it in 1937. For the next 2 years, he basically runs a seminary on the run. They go to different villages to friendly lay people who are willing to house a seminarian. And Bonhoeffer comes and visits for a few days and he teaches classes, again, in secret, underground, to try and prepare students who are sympathetic to the idea that nationalism has no place in Christianity. Then he is invited back to New York City to teach, but he lasts 2 weeks. And he writes the president of Union this letter when he comes back to Germany. So I'm going to read the quote from it because I think it's pretty beautiful. He says, "I have come to the conclusion that I made a mistake in coming to America this time. I must live through this difficult period in our national history along with the people of Germany. I will have no right to participate in the reconstruction of Christian life in Germany after the war if I do not share the trials of this time with my people. Christians in Germany will have to face the terrible alternative of either willing the defeat of their nation in order that a future Christian civilization may survive, or else willing the victory of their nation and thereby destroying our civilization and any true Christianity. I know which of these alternatives I must choose, but I cannot make that choice from a place of security."
It's pretty heavy.
Yeah. When he comes back, again, his family is highfalutin, this is a technical term, very educated, very well connected. And his brother-in-law gets him into the Abwehr. I think I'm saying that wrong. The German military intelligence. And he argues on Dietrich's behalf that because Dietrich has been all over the world, he's been to America, to England, and has all these ecumenical contacts, he would be so good for gathering intelligence for the army. But what's actually happening is that his brother-in-law and his family, who are also in the Abwehr, are involved in a plot to kill Hitler. You know about this plot if you've seen the movie Valkyrie with Tom Cruise.
Yeah, exactly.
Yes, where Tom Cruise has an eye patch. And there's a throwaway line at some point in the movie where they say, oh yeah, there's a pastor who's one of the conspirators. They're talking about Dietrich Bonhoeffer. It's a little Easter egg.
All right on.
Dietrich's job in the conspiracy was to make sure that once Hitler was killed and the replacement government stepped in, that his friends in the House of Lords knew to recognize the new government. And it didn't work. His plan failed. Anyway, the whole thing failed, which you know also if you've seen Valkyrie. But one of the things that's really evident from his writings is that he was not happy about any of this. He was miserable about this whole thing. We can tell part of his thinking. He didn't write a lot about the conspiracy for obvious reasons. If you're in a conspiracy to kill your fascist dictator, you don't write it down. Safety tip number 1. But we know that he learned about the full extent of the genocides happening from being in military intelligence. And he did get that to British agents. And he tried really hard to connect them with resistance fighters in Germany. But because Great Britain's policy was to ignore any German contacts outside of the government because they decided all Germany was an enemy and they had to destroy the whole thing, and because the bishop Bonhoeffer was particularly close to had become unpopular in British parliamentary circles because of his pacifism. And this is George Bell. George Bell had taken a stance against bombing civilian centers in Germany. It wasn't working. And so Bonhoeffer eventually decided that the only thing left to do was participate in this assassination attempt. He says often in his writing that it's not that he does not hold himself sinless, that this is not a question of all of a sudden he sees the right thing to do and he's going to do it. This is all of the choices are bad, and I have to choose the one that will lead to the least bad outcome for other people in the future, while I am going to have to suffer the consequences of doing something that is really horrible. He is really tortured about having to partake in violence. Remember, he becomes a pacifist in New York and is really convicted about that. So having to participate in violence like this was really upsetting for him.
It's kind of a real no-win for the guy.
Yeah, very no-win. So, spoiler, the plot to kill Hitler with remember, it's a bomb in a suitcase under a table, and the table turns out to be too big.
Mm-hmm.
Doesn't work. Everyone is arrested. Bonhoeffer is taken to Tegel prison, where he is for 1.5 years. And then they find the diaries of the main conspirator, who did write it all down. Don't write it down.
Way to go, buddy.
Yeah, good job. And Hitler says, well, you got to kill all of them now. And the next day they were transferred to Flossburg concentration camp and executed. A lot of his writing survives. Letters and papers from prison was smuggled out by his fiancée. It's a complicated. I'm not going to speculate on his personal life. It is a little confusing as to whether they actually were engaged or not. He makes one of his students his heir, Eberhard Bethke, but his fiancée was able to visit him in prison and smuggled all his papers out and letters. He was working on a book on ethics when he died, and that was eventually published. But I want to point out two things. One, Bonhoeffer is quoted in the preface of Project 2025.
That's a big red flag.
And it's very confusing. But the way he's quoted, and I will send Adam this link so that it can go in the show notes. The way he is quoted and the way he is being treated by the far right actually is so upsetting to the family that they have started to speak out against it. The way that he is quoted, they use his terminology about cheap grace. Bonhoeffer talked about there's cheap grace, which is grace without the cross. Grace when you just say, well, yeah, I did something that was wrong, but God forgives me, so it's fine. Grace without repair work. They use that to describe immigration at the border, which is not what Bonhoeffer meant. I don't know that Bonhoeffer had opinions about the southern border or a path to amnesty. I have no idea. He was to not speak on these things. He definitely had opinions about how we treat people who are different than us in a pluralistic society. Had a lot of thoughts about that. The other way that it's used in sort of right-wing discourse is to describe a Bonhoeffer moment, and that's something in that discourse as a clear deciding point between good and evil, where you sort of come to a point where something that was previously unthinkable becomes thinkable. And that's where you have to commit violence.
Kind of doesn't sound like the guy.
Right. Again, it's reducing Bonhoeffer, who was pretty clear that we live in a broken world where a lot of times all the choices before us are bad, that result in pain and death and sin. That sometimes we cannot act but commit sin. But the sinfulness of not acting is worse, because then it causes others more pain and harm. So he was pretty clear that his participation in violence was sinful. It was sinful. He was going to be in trouble. It was not what he was supposed to do. But if he allowed himself to be continually complicit in the Nazi regime, that was also sinful, and it was sinful on a greater scale. He believed God would somehow forgive him. But it wouldn't take away the pain and the cost of what he was doing. He was a pretty realistic theologian. And the other thing I appreciate about him, I've read Life Together, I think, is this little book that he wrote about the experience of doing the Finkenwald Seminary. I've read that now 5 times. He grapples with the idea of what it is to move from sort of Christendom to post-Christendom, which is something Episcopalians talk about a lot. How you move from a church that is comfortably in power to a church that is not.
Mm-hmm.
And what does that look like? And how do you have to change your assumptions and your thinking and your theology based around that shift? Because a lot of times as Episcopalians, we sort of assume that post-Christendom means, well, our congregations are smaller, which is true.
Mm-hmm.
But it also sometimes means going against the culture, going against the state, going against what is popular, what is accepted, what society thinks you ought to be doing. And there are real costs to that. And so how do you think about that? How do you judge that? What does that look like? Which I find helpful. He was able to make that shift pretty clearly.
What I get out of all of this is Bonhoeffer calling us to really examine what it is that's going on around us and how does that line up with what the gospel actually says.
Yeah.
And that these two things, if they're not lining up, that we have to take a really hard look at it and do something about it. Like, this is not, just like with Bonhoeffer, like, it's not a time to sit on our heels and wait for somebody else to do the work. I also can hear, and listener, please understand, I'm not excusing. You heard Megan talk about the kind of repurposing of Bonhoeffer's words by the far right. I understand the leap, the gymnastics that you got to do to get to a point of saying, like, well, things are so bad, so I have to do something. And that something may be a not good thing, but me doing this not good thing may also prevent something way worse. But At the same time, right now, it's not even comparing apples to oranges. It's comparing apples to dump trucks. Like, these are two not even on the same level. For Bonhoeffer to say, like, I see what is going on around me and I see the injustice that is happening and I have to do something. And that's something I will inevitably be held to account for, but I trust in the grace of God, is very different from creating what many feel to be this kind of false sense of panic or alarm in a situation, specifically in our context as Americans, that's not there. But again, when you're trying to push an agenda, it's really easy to take some things and twist them and then throw the other stuff out. You know what I mean? It's just like you were talking about earlier. Like, you can take these few things. Jesus meant this stuff, but these things, he didn't really mean that stuff. That was metaphor. That was allegory. That was to illustrate a point.
Yeah. It's interesting to me how Bonhoeffer found a kinship with the Black church when he was in the US.
Mm-hmm.
And he thought, oh, I can do that. That makes sense to me. But he met the white American Christians and he's like, you guys are obnoxious. You're like my church back home, only worse. And how we were able to hold up a mirror for him in which he saw the problems of the German Lutheran church and then accurately kind of go home and say, okay, here's how we need to live the gospel. Here's what it needs to look like. And yeah, I think a lot of times we confuse the feeling of being oppressed with actually being oppressed.
Right.
Sometimes we confuse, I'm feeling sad and upset, and that must mean something is going on outside of my feelings, and I am actually losing my home, my job, my livelihood, my freedom. Now I'm in jail in a foreign country. Like, those are actual measurable, I'm losing my legal rights. Like, those are measurable things. Or I am feeling a way about things. Those are two different phenomena. But particularly, again, as a white middle-class American woman, I can speak to my white middle-class American women. Sometimes we have trouble telling apart what we are feeling and what is happening.
Right.
We have just a lot of feelings. I think Bonhoeffer reminds us that when bad things start happening, like actual things start happening, then we need to stand up and do something. But we cannot confuse bad feelings with bad things.
It's also kind of icky. It gives, to quote the kids, it gives the ick.
It does.
That we in America, we have what I can only call a persecution fetish. The white American church wants to feel like we are being oppressed or suppressed or held down in some way. And we look historically to situations like this and say, like, well, see, it's the same thing. And it is categorically not the same thing at all. But again, that's what happens in nationalism, is you get to kind of take this revisionist look at history and say, like, see, look, this is the same thing going on here. And it's not the same thing going on here. And oftentimes the people who say, like, see, it's the same thing going on here, wind up being the baddies.
Are we the baddies?
Are we the baddies? Yes. Well, it's the problem of idolatry, right? If you start injecting nationalism into your Christianity, then your Christianity begins to revolve around your nation state, which is not God. You know, again, all heresies are old. It's always a problem to revolve your religion around something that's not God, whether it's a nation state, whether it's your patriotism, whether it's capital, whether it's anything that's not God. You end up having a problem because you end up having to contort everything else to fit that idol. And it ultimately won't help you.
And dare I say, it's maybe, if not one of the main contributors to the decline from, if you want to use big words, Christendom to post-Christendom, is when the center of your theology, when the center of your Christianity stops being Jesus and stops being about the actual gospel that he preached.
Yeah.
Then that is what leads to a decline in Christianity. Because the only reason I feel like I have any room to speak for this is I worked in 21 years in youth and young adult ministry. And the one thing that I know, and listeners, you're not going to like the way I say this, but I'm going to say it this way. Young people can smell hypocrisy like a fart in a car. You know, like they understand. So when we see younger generations moving further and further away from an organized religion, specifically moving away from a Christian worldview, it's because they smell the hypocrisy.
Yep.
And we're getting to a place where it's becoming more and more on display. And thankfully, if we're being smart, we're holding up examples like Bonhoeffer as this is a, hey guys, this is a wake-up call.
Yep. You hear sometimes people talk about the empty churches of Europe. This is part of why the churches of Europe are empty. German Christianity collapsed after World War II. This is why. Nobody wanted to go back in those churches. Those churches had signed off on genocide. 20% signed up for the confessing church. 80% didn't. Did you really, after that war and with the full knowledge of what the Nazis had done, would you really want to go back into a Christian church after that war and say, yep, I wholeheartedly believe everything these people are trying to tell me? I mean, that is catastrophic. A lot of times, I think, as a church, we don't fully reckon with the difference between just surviving and deserving to survive. European Christianity, because it was so wrapped up in nationalism and allied to the state, it largely collapsed because it forgot how to speak truth to power. We are in a similar moment. We are going to have to figure out when we get to the other side of all of this, is the next generation going to be able to say, okay, the church said something in that moment that sounded like the gospel. I still have faith that they can carry the torch of it, into the next decade, because if we don't, God will send somebody who will. It's not a question of God having to make do. God is going to get the message out. The question is whether it's going to be us or whether somebody else will.
That's a hard question for us to wrestle with. And listener, I hope that when we think about the example that Bonhoeffer sets for us, and when we consider this in our lives, especially in the times that we're living in, that we do give it some thought and we do wrestle with it, because that's kind of where the change that we need, I think, comes from, is being willing to take that step to actually wrestle with that thought. So listener, I hope that you got as much out of this as I did, because I definitely am learning a lot about our saints and learning about our faith as Episcopalians. So do us a favor, sneak a bomb right underneath the 5-star review button and blow it up. I don't know if I'm going to have to cut that out, but I'm going to leave it in. So get over there. Let us know what you think about the podcast. If you have questions or comments or anything you want to submit for us to tackle in a future episode with For the Rest of Us, please feel free to do so. You can go to our website, cnyepiscopal.org, to connect with us there. Megan, as always, we need your recommendation.
Oh boy. Okay.
And this is the Easter season. We are celebrating Easter.
Yes.
Christ is risen. He is risen indeed. Alleluia.
Hallelujah.
So here is what we want to know.
Okay.
The rest of us want to know. It's the day after Easter. All the Easter candy is on sale.
Ooh.
What is your number one go-to Easter candy for you to pick up?
Easy. Black jelly beans. It's a controversial choice, but I stand by it.
I wholeheartedly disagree, and you need to repent for your sins. But there you go. You have to take her at her word, because she's a priest, and because she's a priest, it's not just a good idea. That's an order.
It's my servant ministry. Not everybody likes them. I will take all of them.
Well, thank you so much for joining us, listeners, and we will catch you next time on For the Rest of Us. Thanks for stopping by and checking out For the Rest of Us with Canon Megan. If you like the show, maybe subscribe, share it with a friend, leave us a review, and we hope to see you again next time. For the Rest of Us is a production of the Episcopal Diocese of Central New York.